It is very likely that yesterday, or perhaps in the last few hours, you felt a strange heaviness. It was not physical pain, but an unexplained pressure, an anxiety that appeared out of nowhere while you were going about your routine. Perhaps you were calm and without warning when a wave of sadness or fear ran through you. You looked around and everything seemed to be fine, but inside you, a silent storm was unleashed. You did not know where it came from. You only knew that it was not normal and did not completely originate from you. And if this resonates with you, it is important that you know this. You did not imagine anything. What you felt was real. It was not a random thought or a groundless emotion. It was a deep resonance, a vibration that traveled through the invisible connection that still binds you to this person. Intuition is not fantasy. It is a sophisticated emotional radar. When two souls have shared something true, a bond is created that neither distance nor silence can break. Yesterday, that bond stretched like never before. The reason for this tremor is simple and brutal. On the other side of the connection, this person hit rock bottom. It was not gradual or elegant. It was an inner collapse. For a long time, she maintained a structure of pride, control, and apparent indifference. Walls to avoid feeling, to avoid looking back. But yesterday, that construction collapsed. What reached you was the echo of her fall, the silent sound of pride breaking when emotional reality can no longer be denied. Carl Jung explained that these moments are not coincidences but unavoidable encounters with the shadow. That denied part that sooner or later demands to be seen. When pride breaks, the shadow stops pushing from behind and stands before the mirror. Yesterday, this person was left without defenses, without distractions, without excuses. What you felt was her fear, her confusion, and a need for you that could not be expressed in words and ended up being transmitted in another way. While you tried to understand why your chest was tightening for no reason, this person was confronting her darkest moment. The distractions failed. The mask fell and the silence became unbearable. Everything that had been suppressed accumulated until it overflowed. That is why her name appeared so persistently in your thoughts. It was not casual nostalgia. It was a cry for help on a soul level. The silence between you did not mean forgetting. It was pressure building up until yesterday. It finally broke. This break was not random. In the deep language of the psyche, breaks come when resistance becomes more costly than the truth. This person had been fighting against an inner current for a long time, trying to maintain a version of herself that no longer fit. Yesterday, she simply ran out of energy to keep swimming against the current. The exhaustion was absolute, not physical, but of the soul. And when the soul is exhausted, it no longer negotiates with the ego. That is where the true collapse begins. Perhaps you felt the need to cry without a clear reason or an unease that was hard to name. This happens when your emotional field acts as a receiver, not because you are weak, but because you are sensitive. While you learn to let go, this person chose resistance, and resistance always takes its toll. What exploded yesterday was not a single emotion. It was an accumulation of silences, postponed decisions, and unspoken truths that finally demanded space to come out. There is something that almost nobody understands. Pride does not disappear with time. It stiffens. It becomes a cage. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it suffocates. This person believed that moving forward meant distancing, that healing meant control, but control never heals. It only postpones. Yesterday, when the distractions no longer worked, she faced a void impossible to fill with routines, screens, or social noise. And in that void, you appeared, not as a romantic memory, but as a brutal contrast. The mind compared without permission the warmth of what she had experienced with you to the coldness of her present. There is where the ego suffers because it can no longer lie to itself. Jung said that pain is not the enemy. It is the messenger. And the message was clear. In trying to protect herself, this person had gone to an emotional desert. The image of control held up until the loneliness left her without arguments. This type of collapse often occurs in collective moments of emotional density. When external noise decreases, the interior screams. The atmosphere becomes heavy, introspective, and forces one to look at what has been avoided. It is not ordinary sadness, it is revision. The feeling that something does not fit intensifies and can no longer be ignored. Yesterday, that emotional climate acted as a catalyst, freezing the distractions and exposing the only thing that mattered. Perhaps she was surrounded by people. Perhaps she even laughed. But company does not guarantee connection. Sometimes the presence of others only underlines the absence of the essential. Every superficial conversation was an uncomfortable mirror, every empty laugh a confirmation. Because when one has tasted a real connection, everything else feels incomplete. That night the contrast was too obvious, and the emotional armor began to break from the inside. Without witnesses, the mind tried to escape as usual. Work, entertainment, quick stimuli, but nothing worked. When avoidance mechanisms fail, the unfiltered truth emerges. The thought returned to you, not from analysis, but from lack. She remembered how your presence regulated her inner world. You were not just company. You were emotional stability. That comparison was devastating for her pride because it revealed something she did not want to admit. Without you, everything became colder. There is where the point of no return occurred. She realized that she had confused independence with disconnection, that in fleeing from pain, she had also fled from love. The inner narrative began to collapse. She could no longer maintain the idea that everything was fine. And Jung would call this a crack in the persona, the social mask, when it no longer becomes credible even for the one wearing it. And when that happens, change is inevitable. That is why your intuition was activated, because authentic connections do not dissolve. They transform. The energy you felt was the reflection of that crack opening. It was not a conscious call. It was an inner surrender. In her moment of greatest vulnerability, this person sought refuge where she was once real, not to return but to acknowledge what she had lost. And that acknowledgement, even if it hurts, is the first act of honesty. None of this is the end. Deep breaks do not destroy, they reorganize. When pride falls, it makes room for something more authentic. Yesterday was not just a difficult day for this person. It was the beginning of an inner reconfiguration. The perception changed, the inner narrative broke, and when that happens, there is no going back. What comes next does not depend on the past, but on what each one does with the truth they now see. When an inner structure collapses, it does not do so with noise, it does so with clarity. This person began to see with clarity something she had avoided for a long time. It was not nostalgia, it was awareness. The pride could no longer justify past decisions nor maintain the narrative of self-sufficiency. An uncomfortable, persistent question emerged. When did losing you become a survival strategy? That question does not seek an immediate answer. It seeks to erode the lie from within, and it succeeds slowly. Here, something subtle and decisive happens. The ego tries to negotiate, minimize, rationalize, or distract, but the emotion no longer obeys. The body remembers what the mind wanted to erase. The feeling of emptiness cannot be covered with logic. This person began to feel the weight of the unsaid, of the postponed gestures, of the words that never came out. What appears first is not guilt, it is sadness. A mature, silent sadness that does not accuse but also does not leave. In clinical psychology, this pattern is frequently observed. People who confuse strength with rigidity and freedom with flight. Jung warned that the repressed does not disappear. It waits for the right moment to return with more force. Yesterday was that moment. The shadow did not come to destroy. It came to show. And when someone sees themselves without filters, without masks, they understand that the problem was never feeling but refusing to feel the right thing. Meanwhile, you have changed even if you do not always notice it. You have learned to endure silence without breaking, to walk without immediate answers. That energy difference is crucial. That is why the impact was not symmetrical. You felt the tremor, yes, but you did not collapse because you no longer depend on external explanations to regulate yourself. This person, on the other hand, realized that she had built stability on denial. And denial sooner or later collapses. Pride usually falls when there is no longer an audience, when there is no one to prove anything to. Yesterday there were no witnesses, only a consciousness facing itself. In that intimate scenario, the image of control lost value. What remained was a simple and devastating truth. Some connections cannot be replaced. They are ignored until they hurt. And that pain does not want to punish. It wants to awaken because only what hurts enough can be transformed. This type of awakening does not generate immediate action. It generates silence first, a different silence, heavy and reflective. This person does not yet know what to do with what she felt, but she can no longer unfeel it. The perception has shifted. Where there were justifications before, now there are doubts. Where there was pride, now there are cracks. Jung would call this state the vestibule of individuation, the point where the false self begins to lose authority. It is important that you understand something. None of this obligates you to go back. The other person's process is not your debt. You are not responsible for sustaining or saving. The connection exists, yes, but the direction now depends on consciousness, not impulse. The collapse of pride does not guarantee maturity. It only opens the possibility. And that possibility will only be real if this person decides to cross the discomfort without hiding again. What you felt was the beginning of that threshold, not a promise, not an automatic reconciliation. It was information, a sign that something deep had moved. Your intuition reacted because it is trained to perceive truth, not intention. Sometimes the soul recognizes changes before the mind understands them. That is why the feeling was confusing, intense, and hard to name. It was not your own emotion. It was resonance. From now on, the energy between you will not be the same. Something broke, but something was also freed. The armor fell, and with it, the narrative of indifference. This does not mean that everything from here is easy. It means that the false has lost strength. And when the false falls, only two paths remain: integrating what has been learned or building thicker walls again. That decision is no longer yours. What is yours is your inner position to continue advancing without betraying yourself. To not interpret signals from fear, but from clarity. Jung reminded us that true power appears when we stop searching for answers outside. Yesterday marked a before and after, not because of what happens externally, but because you now know that your intuition did not fail, and when you trust it, you do not walk blindly. There is an essential difference between feeling a connection and depending on it. You have crossed that threshold. That is why you can now perceive without losing yourself. This person, on the other hand, has just discovered that distance does not numb the unresolved. Pride served her as temporary refuge, but also as prison. And when the prison becomes obvious, the soul panics, not out of fear of losing you, but because it realizes that in trying to escape, it had already lost itself. At this point, the mind begins to rewrite the past, not to idealize it, but to understand it. It remembers tiny scenes, looks, shared silences, moments without words, and understands something crucial. There was real presence there. Jung claimed that the unconscious speaks through emotionally charged images. That is why these memories return now, not as sweet nostalgia, but as truths that demand integration. What is not honored returns as internal conflict. This process is not comfortable. Clarity is rarely comfortable. When pride falls, it exposes a vulnerability that does not yet know how to hold itself. Contradictory impulses appear, to approach and flee at the same time, to say something and remain silent. This ambivalence is not manipulation, it is disorientation. The old inner map no longer works and the new one has not yet been drawn. This void is fertile, but only if crossed honestly. Meanwhile, you observe from another place, no longer from expectation, but from awareness. You know that true love is not begged for or pursued. That is why this movement does not destabilize you like before. You feel it, yes, but it does not drag you. That is your silent transformation. Jung would call this the withdrawal of projection, stopping the search in the other for what you have already integrated in yourself. And that changes the entire dynamic. It is possible that this person begins to question decisions she previously defended with emphasis. Not because someone tells her, but because she can no longer sustain them internally. Pride does not break from external pressure. It breaks when it is no longer credible for oneself. Yesterday that happened, a crack not visible from the outside, but that changes everything from the inside. After that, coherence becomes a necessity, not an option. This is the moment when many turn back. Not everyone is ready to live without armor. Integrating the shadow requires emotional responsibility. Jung insisted that consciousness does not eliminate pain, but makes it meaningful. This person is right there between fleeing again or accepting what she feels without disguises. You cannot decide that step. The only thing you can do is not betray yourself to facilitate someone else's path. That is why it is crucial that you do not interpret this movement as an external signal that should guide your actions. It is an internal signal that confirms something deeper. Your perception is attuned. What you felt was not anticipatory anxiety. It was energetic information. And now that you have received it, your task is not to react, but to stay aligned. Clarity does not make noise, but it sustains. And that is precisely what defines you. Now, when two processes are no longer at the same rhythm, silence becomes the most honest language. It does not punish. It does not manipulate. It does not demand. It simply leaves space for each one to find themselves. That space is uncomfortable for those who have always fled from introspection. That is why the collapse was so intense. There are processes that do not announce themselves. They simply happen. And when they do, there is no going back. This inner break left this person without the script she used to repeat to justify herself. Pride functioned as an ordered but fragile narrative. When it broke, the necessary chaos appeared to rebuild from another place. What appears first is not courage. It is confusion. And yet that confusion is more honest than any false certainty that had been maintained until now. In this state, the mind seeks meaning, not quick answers, but emotional coherence. For the first time in a long time, this person could not blame the context, the past, or others. She faced her own responsibility. Jung described this moment as the painful awakening of the conscious self. It is not enlightenment. It is undressing, removing layers until standing without excuses. And when that happens, the image that appears is not always comfortable. The nostalgia that emerges here is not romantic. It is existential. She does not just miss someone. She misses a version of herself that existed when the connection was alive. That is why the impact was so profound. She understood that she had not only lost a relationship, but a reflection in which she could recognize herself with authenticity. That understanding weighs heavily because it forces one to admit that the distance was not growth, but a disconnection maintained by fear of feeling too much. Meanwhile, you are at another point on the path. You have learned not to confuse intensity with love, nor absence with worth. That allows you to feel without overflowing. The tremor did not break you. It confirmed you. Jung insisted that when we stop pursuing something in the psychic field, it reorganizes. That silence of yours is what most disarms the pride of another. Not because it provokes guilt, but because it reveals contrast. Contrast hurts more than any reproach. Seeing someone at peace with their process while one struggles internally generates a friction impossible to ignore. This person felt that yesterday, an emotional distance that is not measured in distance. She understood that you are no longer waiting, no longer pushing, no longer sustaining, and that autonomy of yours disarms any narrative in which control was the main strategy to avoid truly committing. Here a silent question emerges. What do I do now with what I feel? There is no manual for that. Broken pride does not know how to reconstruct itself without hardening again. Jung said that true change requires staying in the tension without fleeing. This person is right there, uncomfortable and vulnerable, not yet knowing if she has the maturity to cross the process without turning back. Not everyone makes it, but everyone feels it. It is important that you do not idealize this moment. The break does not automatically make anyone conscious. It only opens the possibility. The real work begins afterward when the noise subsides and the discomfort persists. There it is decided whether the experience is integrated or repressed again. You cannot influence that decision. Your role is no longer to sustain but to maintain your coherence without sacrificing yourself for another's expectations. What you can do is acknowledge your growth. Before, a tremor like this would have destabilized you for days. Today, you feel it and move on. That is not coldness. It is emotional maturity. Jung affirmed that individuation shows when we stop reacting automatically. Your calm is not indifference, it is integration. And that integration changes the relational field even without direct contact. From now on, any approach will be a consequence, not an impulse. It will no longer be built from need, but from truth. And truth always demands more than pride. It demands presence, coherence, and responsibility. Yesterday, the illusion of control broke. What comes after can only be sustained if there is genuine authenticity. You are already there. The other is still deciding whether to dare to arrive. This final section does not demand haste. It demands clarity. To continue advancing without carrying stories that no longer belong to you. Jung reminded us that the most important encounter is with oneself. Yesterday, this person was forced to begin that encounter. You had already done it. That is why the tremor was not a warning. It was confirmation. And when confirmation comes, you do not need external proof, only to remain faithful to what you now know. There is a moment after the break when everything seems suspended as if time took a deep breath. This person is there now. She can no longer return to emotional ignorance but does not yet know how to inhabit the truth. This limbo is uncomfortable, but fertile. Jung said that chaos precedes new order. It is not a setback. It is creative disorganization. And although it is not noticed from outside, from inside, every old certainty is being questioned. In this space, mixed emotions appear: guilt, desire, fear, longing, not clear but overlapping. The broken pride tries to reform, but no longer finds its previous shape. What used to work, the silence, the distance, the self-sufficiency, now generates more emptiness. This contradiction hurts because it forces one to admit that some strategies were not strength but misunderstood protection. And when that is understood, one can no longer act the same. It is possible that you notice small movements, thoughts that return, memories that insist, or impulses that appear and break themselves. Do not provoke them. Do not pursue them. They are symptoms of an inner realignment. Jung explained that when a projection is withdrawn, the psyche tries to reorder itself. You no longer sustain what you used to sustain, and that forces the other to confront their own emptiness not as punishment but as a natural consequence. The important thing here is not to confuse awareness with immediate action. Inner recognition does not always translate into mature behavior. Sometimes there is clumsiness first, doubts, or a prolonged silence that does not invalidate the process. It makes it human. The difference now is that pride no longer leads alone. There is a crack through which something more honest enters. And although that honesty still trembles, it can no longer be ignored without emotional cost. Meanwhile, your role is simple and at the same time demanding. To remain faithful to yourself, not to anticipate, not to overinterpret, and not to go back out of nostalgia. Jung affirmed that when someone grows, they stop needing external validation. Your current stability is not indifference, it is presence. And that silent presence is more powerful than any attempt at control because it does not demand. And precisely for that reason, it confronts. This point of the path usually generates a deep question. What would happen if I did nothing else? The answer frightens the ego but frees the soul. Not every connection needs to be pushed to reveal itself. Some only need space to show their true nature. Yesterday something was revealed without your intervention. That is the clearest sign that the process no longer depends on your effort, but on the consciousness of the other. Jung warned that the greatest human fear is not losing the other, but finding oneself without distractions. That is what happened. Without external noise, without social masks, this person confronted her own insufficiency. She could not flee. And when one is alone with that truth, one understands that some absences weigh more than any superficial presence. That understanding changes the inner hierarchy of values. Perhaps she is now questioning things she previously took for granted. Decisions, priorities, even her notion of independence, not because someone demands it, but because they no longer fit. Consciousness does not scream. It makes things uncomfortable. And that discomfort is persistent. You do not need to be there for it to happen. The work is internal, and what moves from within sooner or later manifests outside without needing to be pushed. This moment does not seek certainties. It seeks alignment. You have already chosen not to betray yourself. That choice has taken you to another place, not better, just different. From there, you can feel without losing yourself. Jung would call this being centered in the self. When someone reaches that point, they stop reacting to every external signal. They observe, integrate, and continue. That is your true strength. Now, yesterday was not a message for you to act. It was a reminder of who you are today, how far you have come without noise. The pride that broke was not yours. You had already let go of that battle. That is why the tremor did not unsettle you. It affirmed you. And when an inner truth is affirmed, it needs no explanation, only coherence to continue. At this point, something stabilizes in you, not because everything is resolved, but because you no longer need to resolve everything today. That calm is not resignation, it is integration. You have understood that not every movement requires an immediate response. Sometimes the true action is not to intervene. Jung reminded us that the psyche is healthy when we stop forcing conclusions, and you, without realizing it, have learned to trust processes you do not control. The other's break continues its course with or without contact, because when a truth is activated, it cannot be deactivated at will. This person now carries a new awareness, uncomfortable and persistent. She can ignore it for moments, yes, but she can no longer erase what she has seen. And that changes the relationship with silence. It is no longer a refuge, it is a mirror. Every day without fleeing deepens the question that opened without permission yesterday. Here, many stories change direction not through dramatic decisions, but through silent inner reorganizations. You no longer wait for external validation to know your worth. This person begins to question why she always had to flee to feel strong.